7 o'clock, so maybe it's time to start, and I think probably a few more people will roll in. We had a lot of interest in this tonight. So my name is Brenda Macdougall, and I am the University Chair of Nature, Family and Society. And I want to thank everybody for coming this evening, and I'm going to just give Tag and Victoria a quick chance to introduce themselves, and then we'll set up the panel and explain what's going on.
So, Kwe Kakina, Tagwanibisan Indigenous Affairs. I am a fourth-year undergrad student at the University of Ottawa, and I'm helping set up, well, I have a few hats here at the university. I'm a programming assistant with the Indigenous Resource Center. I'm a research assistant under the Institute of Indigenous Research and Studies. And so I'm just here kind of helping to process the questions, hand them over. I wasn't actually expecting to be on camera, so I'm glad I'm wearing earrings. But hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here, and thank you for coming.
Victoria Marchand. I'm also from Kitchi, and on my mother's side, I'm from Winneway, more specifically Hunters Point settlement. It's an old Indian settlement, so I'm a proud Anishinaabe on both sides. I'm so happy to be here and supporting this webinar. I'm the coordinator of the Indigenous Resource Center. I take school as well on the side, and I work really closely with Brenda and Tag as well as Trisha at Ottawa. So I'm really excited to learn and hear more, and I will be in the background. So if anyone needs anything, Tag and I will be here, and I hope you all enjoy.
So this is very much set up to be a bit of a conversation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a general introduction for our three guests this evening, and explain a little bit about how we brought everybody together to talk about family by design and Indigenous feminisms and relationality. And then I've got three very general questions so that they can talk with one another about how they see the answers to those questions. And then after about 45 minutes, an hour, we will open the floor to questions, and Tag and Victoria will be reading the chat for your questions and sort of be curating them a little bit so that we have an efficient way of addressing our three amazing women tonight. So Kim Tallbear is an associate professor at the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta, and she is a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples, Technoscience and Environment. And in fact, all of our guests this evening are Canada Research Chairs, which I think is so incredibly cool to have three Native women running the CRC program as far as I'm concerned. Kim is perhaps best known for her book, Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging and the False Promise of Genetic Science, which is an amazing book. If anybody hasn't read it yet, please check it out. And she's a citizen of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate. Kim Anderson is Métis. She's an associate professor in the Department of Family Relations and Applied Nutrition at the University of Guelph, and she is a CRC in Indigenous relationships. She's worked for many, many years with elders, with knowledge keepers across Canada, and has a number of amazing books detailing the work that she's done with them, including Life Stages in Native Women, Memory, Teachings, and Story Medicine. And Tricia Maguire-Adams is new to the University of Ottawa. She's been here for a year now, although she did some graduate work here. She's Anishinaabe Kwe from the Thunder Bay region, and she conducts community-driven research in the Indigenous health and well-being. She's in the Faculty of Education, where she is also a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Good Health Sovereignties. You notice that I'm avoiding all of the Anishinaabe words, Tricia. So the reason I asked these three in particular to come this evening is that they've all done work around gender, family, and health as broad concepts and categories. And for a few of them, then it comes through these vehicles of sex, gender, and sexuality, which I think are so important for us to be talking about as Native women these days. they all speak to ways that we can reclaim our own terminology, our languages, our ontological categories, and our understandings of womanhood in very important conceptual ways through our histories, through our traditions, through the life cycles of gender and age. And they really offer us something as Indigenous people as a way to reclaim our humanity and to claim our humanity in a society that denies us that very right. And so they all offer something much bigger to the world when we're struggling to think about how to deal with inclusivity and diversity and equality. They ground us in those traditions and those thought processes in really meaningful and important kinds of ways. So I'm going to throw the floor open to the questions now. I'm inspired by each and every one of them, but I want everybody to feel the same level of inspiration. And so the first question that I'm just going to open the evening with is, perhaps we can begin with defining what it means to be an Indigenous feminist, and how have you been shaping that definition through your research and the other kinds of work that you've been doing? And the awkwardness of Zoom. Kim?
I was thinking Kim Anderson and I were on a panel with Audra Simpson at the University of Saskatchewan. When was it, 2016? And we answered this question, and I thought I should have watched that again, because I remember thinking, oh, that was a really great answer I gave, but I don't remember what I said now. That was a really great event. There were so many people there. So for me, I mean, I often talk about this. I came to feminism through the side door, I would say. Like many Indigenous women, you know, I grew up in a community where I was like, oh, that's white woman stuff, right? That's not for us. But of course, all the women in my family totally controlled and ran everything and set the agenda for our lives and supported the family. I guess that, you know, I guess they were feminists. But for me, I kind of came to the term working with feminist science studies scholars. And I realized very quickly when I started doing science studies, so when I was doing the research for my book, Native American DNA, as a graduate student, and sitting around the table with women who were feminist scientists and also queer folks as well, and working with queer science studies scholars, I realized very quickly that they were making similar critiques of the masculine, they were calling them masculinist hierarchies of science. I would have thought of them more as racial hierarchies. So it became clear to me that feminism, quote unquote, was for me really about disrupting hierarchies. And those hierarchies were about race, they were about gender, they were civilized versus savage, right? They were about sexuality. And I was very much in conversation with and informed by and edified by feminist and queer thinkers, especially around this. And so I said, okay, I can buy into that definition of feminism. That makes sense for me. It's not only about women, which was not necessarily a question that always resonated for me in a world where I saw women running everything. Not to say we were not subject to, you know, gendered violence and hierarchies and things like that, but that wasn't what was immediately obvious to me. So I'll stop with that. I might have more to say, but.
Maybe I'll jump in because I can respond to what Kim just said about that event that we did. Because indeed, I remember that too. It was in March and it was in 2016. So here we are, I guess this is 5 years later, right? Doing it. I don't know how that happened. But I looked, there's a book called In Good Relation that Sarah Nichol and Amanda Fair edited. And they start out in Sarah Nichol's introduction, she starts out talking about that event. And so you did actually give a really good answer because it's in the book, right? So you can read about it. But, you know, she starts out by saying that we all kind of like expressed how, you know, feminism or even Indigenous feminism wasn't something that we felt like, you know, you just kind of claimed immediately. And it really represents Indigenous women, I would say on the whole, about the resistance to white stream feminism, and then trying to like come into this relationship with the term, right? So when I was thinking about that, I was also thinking about how, you know, we've gone from that space of people not really identifying with it or not feeling very comfortable with it to now it seems like there's all sorts of it all over the place, and people, you know, applying it in different ways. And so when I was charged with writing kind of like a survey chapter on Indigenous feminism for that Routledge Handbook on Critical Indigenous Studies, I was talking about the kind of like generational, not like waves of feminism, but generational elements of feminism, and how Indigenous feminism, how it's evolved to the point where now there's so much more and so much less, I guess, resistance to it. But yet still we're still trying to like figure out what it means and what it can do, right? So I was talking about the different generations and going back to the, you know, the women that the Jesuits encountered, you know, in the 1600s on the, you know, in the eastern part of the continent, and how the women that they describe as the firebrands of hell were in fact, you know, in the Indigenous feminists that go back that far for us, right? And so I don't know, I thought I would read a little story. Actually, I'll start with a story, and I don't take up too much, but I want to read the story that I put in that chapter, because it's a story that our teacher, me and Brenda have, Maria Campbell is a teacher, and she told me the story about this woman in her community, and I put it in there because I wanted to show that like in Kim's family, like in families that go back, there's always been these women who have been like the firebrands of hell, right? Like they will stand up against, you know, patriarchy, the church, all that dismantling of our extended family systems, all those things that were going on. So I'm just going to read it, just like chill and, you know, story time, and then I'll pass it over to Trisha. So this is Maria's story about a woman that she called Flora. So she says, when I think back in the context of religion, I remember one woman named Flora. She was designated as Anglican, but she never went to church. It wasn't uncommon in our community for Anglicans to attend the Catholic Church if they lived too far away from their own denomination. But Flora never went to any of the churches. She was independent. She just did what she wanted to do. Now, this is in the Road communities in Saskatchewan, of course, where Maria's from. Flora never married, never had children, but she had a lot of men visitors. It wasn't about prostitution or anything sexual. It was just that men really liked her. I knew this from eavesdropping on conversations between my mother and my aunties. Their stories revealed how the men in our community looked to Flora for discussion, and how they went to her when they wanted to talk about women's views. The women in my family were never jealous of her. In fact, they wanted the men to visit. I remember that when a woman was beaten up, my mom and aunties always hoped the guy would end up at Flora's because they wanted Flora to talk to him. My nookums also held influence with the men, influence on matters of community life, but Flora's relationship with those men was different. Flora's house was almost like a men's clubhouse. Men would play poker there all night, or they would come to sit around and have tea and talk. Flora's house welcomed women as well, and many women could be found there at any time during the day. Flora was also the helper of the midwives. They would ask her to look after the mother who had just had a baby, or the mother who had been sick before she had her baby. She was the one they would call on because she knew they would be there immediately. Flora was helpful too because she was really good with kids. She always encouraged relationships with children and was kind to them. And if someone was dying or if there was a death and the midwives needed help to dress the body, they would call on Flora. Nobody had to worry about paying her because she wouldn't take money. Instead, she would take tobacco and cigarette papers. There was always a smoke with a cup of tea if you went to her home. I learned that on my first visit to her house as a young woman. She had a bag of tobacco hanging from a wooden peg and a bowl of cigarette papers nearby, which she pointed to when I sat down with my tea. I didn't smoke, of course, but I was grateful that she treated me like a grown-up. And I am grateful that she was an important part of my life, as today it allows me to imagine a visit with those women the Jesuits first encountered. Because Flora was always there when you needed her, she had some kind of authority in the community, although nobody ever talked about it. But amidst this traditional respect and authority, there was the church. And quite simply, the church hated Flora. The priest made Flora his enemy and had multiple ways of putting her down. For example, he would never say anything bad about her himself, but he would fuel bad gossip about her. It is noteworthy that he always used one or two of the women who were already known as gossips and talebearers, women who were jealous of Flora. I remember one woman in particular who was very close to the priest. She was a devoted Catholic, kept the church clean, cooked meals for him, made sure everything was okay when he came to the community. She was the one who would promote gossip. In the wintertime, she would report that there were devil's tracks seen around Flora's house again, and that a tall man was seen leaving the house every night for a week during the last full moon. Well, when you're a child and you're listening to that kind of slander, you can get really frightened and curious because it feeds into what you've already observed. That a strong woman is feared and curious because, that a strong woman is feared and isolated by some sectors of the community. With whisperings of a tall, dark man and devil's footprints and all-night poker games, you can imagine the response in a small, isolated community already full of stories of Witigos, Pakakanasak, and Chipis. And so, with his promotion of frightening stories and community gossip, the priest incited plenty of lateral violence in our community, and he did it in such a way that most people never knew it was him. The priest also modeled physical violence. I remember one incident in particular. I was about 6 or 7 years old. We were sitting in church one morning when Flora walked in, which was remarkable to me because I had never seen her there before. She walked almost to the front to get a man who was sitting with his children. When she touched him on the shoulder, he got up immediately. I later learned his wife was having a difficult birth, and so the old ladies had called for him. But when this man got up, the priest, who was in the middle of whatever he was doing, grabbed the long, skinny whip that he kept by the altar, the whip that he used to threaten us kids if we didn't sit quiet and pray, the kind of whip you use on horses. He grabbed that whip, came down from his altar, and beat Flora on the back as she walked out. She didn't run. She didn't do anything except walk out quietly. That priest whipped her all the way out the door, all the while yelling at her in French. He was so angry that when he came back to the altar, he was out of breath and red-faced, and he ranted and raved throughout the rest of the service. During those long moments that Flora was being whipped out of the church, nobody said a word. Nobody looked back, but I looked. And that memory, like a photograph, has forever been etched within me. Today, when I hear the word violence, this is the first memory that flashes across my mind. Since childhood, I have associated that priest with the way Indigenous women are treated in our communities. It is both powerful and haunting, as were the dignity and strength of Flora as she walked out of the church. So I put that story in as a tribute both to my teacher, Maria, who told it to me, and the generations of feminists that raise us, and to show how far back it goes. And it's just loaded with what I later unpack is I see as practices of Indigenous feminism by this lady, Flora. So I want to honor her and all those that have come before us tonight because we're here, walking in their moccasins. And yeah, I just want to offer that respect in that story. So Miigwetch.
Miigwetch, thanks so much for that offering of that story, a very profound story for sure. Just before I jump in, I just want to say how grateful I am and humbled I am to be in conversation with both Drs. Anderson and Tallbear, both of whom, through your respective scholarship, have guided my own thinking and development as an Indigenous feminist and as a new academic. So Miigwetch for that. So much like what both have already shared, I came to Indigenous feminism as a way to try to better understand the violence in my own upbringing, but also like the very heavy patriarchy that was involved in my upbringing. So it's been a very long journey. And when I first started on this road, I was really against feminism, much like a lot of the forebearers of early Indigenous feminist thinkers, because I thought we didn't need it. Once we knew our teachings as Indigenous women and our teachings and our traditions, that is where the heart of our teachings are, and we don't need feminism to show us. But as I traversed my journey, I quickly realized that feminism is a tool to help us untangle how patriarchy has become embedded within some of our teachings and some of our practices. And so that is where I land now with using Indigenous feminism, as I use it as a lens from which to better critique, see, and see the effects of ongoing settler colonialism and patriarchy in our communities. And I also see it as a place where Indigenous women we can theorize from our own perspectives, our own Debajamawanan, our own stories about our decolonial thoughts and our decolonial practices. We can reflect deeply on our own personal experiences to then bring that forward and advance community interests and advance the field of Indigenous feminist thinking. And so for me, Indigenous feminism creates that space where we can engage with our stories, which resonates back to the field. And this is important because we continually need to disrupt settler colonialism. It has not stopped, it is ongoing. And we need to sit to think about how our actions can cause that ongoing disruption. So I'll leave it at that for now, but I will add further into the conversation. Miigwetch.
I'm interested that all of you have sort of come to this space where the recognition that, and I've had the same experience, rejection of feminism as a concept, not certain that it is something that sits within our communities or if it's something external to us, if it's a tool to be used to take down structures of colonialism, or if it's in fact embedded in our lives. And so are we reclaiming feminism, or are we simply just redefining it according to the way that we need it to work?
From my point of view, I wouldn't use the word reclaim, because I'd be interested to know, just to have a sample of Indigenous languages in which there is a roughly translatable term that equals feminism. Perhaps I don't know. Right. And then we'd have to first establish what we mean by that in English. I had a student who wanted to, many of our students at the University of Alberta are in Native Studies, are learning Cree or studying Cree, and was really interested in thinking through the ideas that we were exploring in our Indigenous Feminisms unit in my theory course. She also didn't like the word. I had a couple of Indigenous women in that course who were just kind of anti-feminist theory. And then when they got into it, they said, oh, okay. So how would we talk about this overarching analytic in, say, Cree or, other Indigenous languages? And I suspect it would be mind-blowingly, perhaps there would be ways in which we could find words or frameworks that would be in part translatable, but they wouldn't be fully translatable. And I am really interested in us eventually, theorizing out of Indigenous languages. And then maybe there would be a completely different kind of term. But I mean, feminism, given that we're working in English and within this intellectual genealogy too, it's strategic, and it does help us perform incisive analyses of the role of patriarchy and settler colonialism, heteropatriarchy. So it's quite strategic, and it's not that I'm saying we should leave it behind, but I would not say reclaim, probably. But I'm totally open to somebody else who's a language speaker saying, no, actually, there's a way in which it's very translatable, and here's why I would argue in favor that it's a reclaiming. But
yeah, that would be a great project, right? A great thing to do. Like, I guess the question is it, I mean, feminism is in resistance to certain types of oppression, right? So, so even the one like in the story that I read, she's resisting certain types of colonial oppression, right? And not to get into this thing about pre-contact and, our own way, because of course it's not, there's no such thing as like, it was this way and then it changed. But, if it's not about resisting that heteropatriarchy that came with colonialism, then is it such a thing, or is it something else in terms of women's authorities or women's particular kinds of responsibilities, or the ways in which women organize, which of course are cultures that change all the time, change over time, right? But there seems to be something in terms of the kinship, the way in which women work together, which I've always been interested in, like how we organize, how we work together, or like, when you're talking about your own families, how the women did that, what is that, right? Is that something that's kind of like in resistance or response to something? Or is it something, not to be essentialist, but is there something there in which the ways in which we're able to like work and come together collectively to do certain types of things, right? So I think back to those firebrands of hell that the Jesuits were writing about. And I'm like, yeah, those sisters had something going on, collectively too, right? And that culture, those cultures that they were part of, there was something going on, as far as that kind of like sisterhood, right? So, you know, certainly it's a strategic tool, and we absolutely, like, I think I wrote this piece for Cheryl Suzak's anthology, and I'm like, affirmations of an Indigenous feminist. Like, I was trying to always excuse myself for going there, but you know, I was like, well, I was resistant too. And then I went and I read all this stuff, and you know, people say, oh, feminism, like it's one thing. No, I mean, it's such a huge, expansive, you know, theoretical field. There's many different entry points. And once I started reading, I'm like, you know what, we need to pay attention to this, because it talks about how, you know, women get like, you know, we can get fundamentalist about stuff, and women can get slotted into certain roles, and you know, mothers of the nation, and all this stuff that gets used, not in our, you know, not to our benefit, right? So we do need to use it strategically. We need to look at, you know, globally, across cultures, at how we can use those tools to begin to unpack and understand oppression. So that's good. And then there's the other parts of it, which are like, what does it offer in terms of that relationality, which is, I guess, part of what we're going to talk about. But, you know, in terms of good kinship, and in terms of relationality with all our relations, I think there's something there too, right?
Yeah, and I think, yeah, from an Anishinaabe perspective, I agree. I don't think there's going to be one term that could fully encompass this concept of feminism, because, yeah, there was no, yeah, when I think about the teachings of Indigenous women, we were always the catalyzers of our nations. We held our world together, as Dr. Brenda Macdougall discusses in her book, and how these traits, these authoritative traits, and I really like the story that Kim shared, because it talks about this woman being this authority figure, and people turn to her, and that's in Anishinaabe, it's Mindimaway. We held up these women as the authority figures, not in a punitive way or in a power over or hierarchical way, but they literally were the foundation of our families and our communities, and they were the ones that made the decisions. And so I'm not sure that's equally relatable to or nicely packaged within a feminist understanding. It's more about an Indigenous woman understanding, I think, of women's roles and responsibilities.
I was looking for an online Dakota English dictionary, because I don't want to go grab mine, but they're not great. But I was thinking about, for example, like when I was studying Dakota at our tribal college, I remember the word citizen. I don't remember what it was now, but the word for citizen that they decided to, the Dakota word they decided to use as the translation for citizen when they were writing the dictionaries in the 19th century, meant they can take care of themselves and their family. Okay, sure. We can understand in the 19th century civilizing project, when they're trying to push farming and Christianity and, you know, heteronormative lifelong monogamous marriage and transfer of property to sons, when this is their project that they're trying to push on to civilize the Indian, that you can imagine them saying that Dakota word, they can take care of their family, is a good translation of citizen. So it's not right. And so I wonder about feminism too. Whose project is that word crafted in response to in the English language? Whose projects, right? And again, not that because we're working in English, it's not that it's not valid. It is valid, and we live in this world. But if we could go into our ancestors' languages, I think we would have be carving out concepts that might include what we do within feminist practice and theorizing and activism in English and in this world, but there might be this much kind of different carving out of the meanings of our cultures and our languages, right? Like whatever that word in Dakota, I mean, it could be, you could cut, slice, and dice it to mean citizen in English, but it probably meant was coming out of a completely different worldview. Right, and was probably referring to something actually coming out of a different genealogy. Anyway.
No, I think that's really important, that our words are not easily translated, and that there is this layer of definition within a lot of the existing dictionaries that reflect Christianity, that reflect settler colonial understandings of the civilizing project. I'm really struck that everybody has used phrases like heteropatriarchy, heteronormativity. And so I kind of want to push a little bit around notions of gender And Kim Tallbear alluded to it as she started, but I'm going to read one of the quotes from Kim that have really resonated with me recently. And what it is Kim Tallbear wrote, "I don't understand how we go after blood quantum and private property without going after monogamy and marriage as this act of colonialism, and that it fundamentally unhinged our communities by this insistence of monogamy." And I'll say from my own experience that, you know, taking Native studies back in the 1980s from Winona Wheeler, she would talk about the band lists and how when Cree men, Assiniboine men, Saulteaux men signed into treaty, they often had multiple wives, and within a 5-year period, those second and third and fourth wives would disappear, and they'd just be widows. So they don't disappear from the band list, but they disappear from the marriage. And so I want to follow up a little bit around this notion that you're talking about in terms of heteronormativity, heteropatriarchy, and this grounding of our world in monogamy.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I feel like I've talked about this all the time, so people are sick of hearing it, but I don't know who's listening out there. So, I think so. In my next book, sorry that my speaker's doing something weird. In my next book, I'm going to talk about, and I'm drawing on historians. I'm not a historian, right? So historians of marriage, like, and these are white feminist historians, Nancy Cott in the U.S. and Sarah Carter in Canada, who's also in our Faculty of Native Studies, joint with History and Us. And also people like Kate Denial, who wrote a book on country marriages and marriages among Dakota and Ojibwe people in the 19th century. So, I mean, we know by the archival record, right, that exactly what you said, Brenda, that we had monogamous one-on-one lifelong marriage that is considered an appropriate marriage in the eyes of the church and the settler state, imposed onto our people, which completely disrupted our forms of marriage or partnership, or if it's not partnership, it's our sort of plural marriages and plural arrangements, right? And disrupted the way that we raise children and how people live together, how they had sex. All of that's very much disrupted by settlers in the act of imposing Christianity onto our ancestors, and the act of imposing the English language. There's also a compulsory conversion to monogamy. There's a compulsory conversion to their definition of marriage, which again is organized around land property. Women and children get treated like the property of men. Men inherit property, both land, you know. And so it is just astounding to me that it seems like half of our Native studies literature is, you know, bashing blood quantum, which, you know, I've written on that extensively too. But it's very, I think maybe in some of the Pacific Indigenous literature, but it's just not really taken up. There's not, I feel like, much of a critique of marriage and monogamy, and it's so central to the disruption of Indigenous relations, the partitioning of collectively held lands into private property, right? It's so central to compulsory conversions to Christianity, which in the story Kim told, I just wanted to, you know, I rarely get angry. I was just enraged. I was like, I want to take that whip and beat the crap out of that priest. Like the violence they did to people, you know, like really makes me want to get violent in return. So that's what they did, right? That's what they did. And so I don't know originally what your question is, but I think we need to interrogate this as well, because it's a violent disruption of our relations, right? And then what happens to those other wives? You know, what happens to their children? This whole notion of there are illegitimate children, it's disgusting, just disgusting, the kinds of values that they imposed onto our ancestors that we are still, that have caused tremendous intergenerational trauma, and that we're still living with today. This kind of shaming sexually, cultural shaming, religious shaming. And marriage and monogamy are at the heart of that. And so we can get into then a big long discussion about how this enables them to turn sex into something that's scarce, that is to only be had between certain subjects at certain times, and it then becomes used as a tool of violence. And now we're at the point where, you know, it's really difficult to even talk about sexuality. Tracy Bear and I talk about this. It's why we started our show TP Confessions, which we'll talk about later. You know, she said when she was beginning to teach her Indigenous erotica class at the University of Alberta, she decided to teach that because she also works on missing and murdered Indigenous women's issues and has this Indigenous Women in Resiliency project. And whenever she Googled Indigenous women and sexuality, all she saw on the internet was violence. That is so heartbreaking. Because sex is one way of good relating. It's one form of good relating. And if we mostly relate it to violence and mostly think of it as scarce, it's such a sad form of deprivation of touch and relation, right? And so anyway, I think I got off your original question, but that's why I write about this stuff and why I'm focused on this right now. It's an act of pushing back against those disgusting violent impositions by the settler state, the church, and science. And it's also about thinking about ways in which we can heal, and sexuality can also be one form of healing. So.
Right. Just to add, you know, there's stories that are shared in the Treaty 3 territory about, from the perspective of Maggie Wilson, that was recorded in Rainy River Lives, where she talks about women having the choice to have multiple partners, multiple husbands. And it was never questioned. It was just what needed to be done for that family to be a family, for them to live their lives in a way that was respectful of our Anishinaabe governance systems. And I think that's one element that would be interesting to turn to, is to better understand how the option for people to choose their partners, regardless of how many or whom they might be, was an enactment of Indigenous governance systems. Like, it was enacted within a structure and a system that was in relation to the land and to the kinship networks that were existing on those lands. And prior to colonization, prior to the critiques that Kim just brought forward, like, none of that was questioned. It was just the way things were.
Well, and that's part of what the Jesuits were horrified about with the firebrands of hell, right? I think that's part of what they were writing about, and part of what they had to control, contain, and shut down. And so, yeah, that's part of the whole project. It's a tool of the oppression, and then it becomes, like Kim says, part of the violence that goes across the generations going back. So that, I mean, that's why I like the story about Flora too, because you know, she doesn't get married, and she's just kind of like, we don't know what her sexuality was, or, you know, she didn't talk about that because but you know, that's why I'm saying, like, that's why I say, well, she was an Indigenous feminist, you know, like she did her thing, right? She had all these relations, she had all these responsibilities. She had all this kinship, she was a keeper of that kinship, right? And you know, she in the face of incredible oppression, like terrible violent oppression, right, in the community, not just from, like, I mean, that story of focus on the priest, because we were talking about the Jesuit relations before it and so on, but also laterally, right, within the community, as you know, whatever, you know, that this a strong woman is feared, or the way she was, also had, you know, there was all this. The community relied on her to a great extent, but there was also people who were buying into the, you know, the ways that were being forced on them too, and then the lateral violence that happens as a result.
Kim, where does that firebrands of hell phrase come from again?
That's the Jesuits. It's in the Jesuit relations.
Oh, because I'm going to make a T-shirt with that on it. Firebrand of hell. That's awesome.
I'll send you the reference. I'll try to find the actual, I have it somewhere, where, you know, which
we can do some TP Confessions merchandise. We'll talk to you.
I like being, yeah, we want to be firebrands of hell, right? So, yeah.
Well, and so in the process of firebrands of hell, and I think what seems to underpin that, but also what underpins this, you know, part of the story of Flora, is that there is these deep familial or social familial relationships. So while there was some lateral violence for Flora, there's also clearly like a sense that she has something to offer and is expected to offer it largely to men, but in protection of women. And so this notion of Indigenous ideas about relationships, and particularly how things are grounded in concepts of family and not necessarily friends, as we think of it in an English context, but that people are extended out laterally as family. And so what does it mean then to take this idea of family and apply it to how we understand the environment, how we understand human and non-human interactions, categories of age and gender? I love your dog still, Kim.
No, sorry, he's like,
Gotcha. Tricia, do you want to take a stab at that?
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've done some thinking on this because, of course, in Anishinaabe, we have an understanding of entire web of connections about how to live a good life. And a lot of that stems from our relationships to the animals, and the environment upon which we had this integral relationship with them. And I turned to the works. Norval Morrisseau wrote this incredibly important work from, I think it's the 60s, The Legends of My People. And he has some paternal relations to my own community of Bangwaniashi and Anishinaabe, which is around the Lake Nipigon territory, northwestern Ontario, and how he shows through his understanding this really deep interweaved connection between Anishinaabe, the water relations, the animal relations, the spiritual relations in the skies, and how all of this was just part of our being and our existing on this territory. But what happened for my community, in particular, Bangwaniashi, it was a very poignant example of the forced disruption that happened through settler colonial domination, because prior to 1960, my ancestors lived and thrived in our small territory. And then after 1960s, the provincial government wanted to come in and make it a provincial park. So they forcibly dispossessed the 6 or so families that were living there. They burnt down their houses and people were scattered and dispossessed in order for white people to have a recreational leisure space, which is Black Sands Provincial Park. I'm happy to say that we've repatriated our territory and we do have families living there now. But that complete disruption not only happened to our bodies, where we were forcefully displaced to, say, Rocky Bay or Thunder Bay, it happened to our relations and our connections to those animals. And both in the water, in the sky, but also the Manitous and all the spirits surrounding that territory. And so when I read Norval's work, it reminds me that we have this this relationship still. It needs to be renewed. And so, and within my realm of Indigenous health and well-being, I thought deeply about how can I renew that relationship. And in one of our creation stories, it features, sometimes it's otter, sometimes it's muskrat, and sometimes it's Nanaboju, and sometimes it's Sky Woman. But we have these stories where otter was the one to give their life in order to create Turtle Island. And we have so many otters in our territories, and that relationship in and of itself shows the deep connection to our own creation of living here. And what does our relationship mean to otter, and what knowledge can we garner from that gift of otter giving their life in order for Turtle Island to be created? And so for me, within an Indigenous health and well-being lens, that offering of their body to help the nation of Indigenous people thrive on Turtle Island is something that I'm very curious about. And that reconnection to our animal stories within the lens of health and well-being.
Anyone else want to go?
What I'm thinking about is not with non-humans, surprisingly. So I don't know if Kim wants to go first.
I got distracted by the dog, by the other relation, by the four-legged furry one. It's like he's got his own logic about how these things are supposed to go. But yeah, I don't know. So I'm a little bit, I'm not sure. Like, I mean, we're talking about all our relations and relationality, right? So it's again that form of kinship. But I will say I teach in a Department of Family Relations and Human Development and Applied Nutrition. And when I first came, I went there because there was no gender studies or no Indigenous studies, these things that I do. And I said, well, I've been teaching in an Indigenous Studies department up till now, and I teach courses on medicine garden and this and that. So I said, really, all the stuff I've been teaching, it's all about family, right? It's all family relations. So I could still teach my course on plant medicine in a family relations department, right? So now, mind you, I haven't done that yet because I don't teach all that much. But yeah, that notion of family, kinship, relations, responsibilities that go, not just the natural world, but the ancestors, the ancestral world, the spirit world. We think about that in all of the work that we do as Indigenous feminist practice as well. And people are, talking about what this radical relationality, or there's in that water, that decolonization, education, and society issue on water, and Yazzie and Baldy are talking about radical relationality, and being an Indigenous feminist is really just about being a good relation. So it has to do with that, how you're relating to the water. What are you doing, in terms of your practice as taking up those, those reciprocal relations with all the relations. So I don't know if that, so yeah. So even the dog, right? I think about him and the relationality, what he's offering, what I got to offer him on a daily basis. That's all part, to me, that's all part of what we're talking about here, right?
I think that's a great way of changing the narrative, though, and I was going to talk about that maybe when we talk about TB Confessions later. You teaching a course on plant medicine in a what is it, a department on family
relations.
Yeah, that's changing the story. Actually, that's changing the settler story and pushing at their categories, which I think is really profoundly important, right? So I think that's great. So I'll just talk a little bit, Brenda, about that. I was thinking, I don't remember what Tricia was saying that made me think about this, but and it is more about humans, but maybe I'll get there to the non-human. I just wrote a piece that I did for the Sexuality Education Resource Center Manitoba. It was basically a storytelling event for Valentine's Day, and the talk was about promiscuous relating, and I'm trying to redeem the notion of promiscuous. It's very much a negative definition in the English language dictionary. And I was, that piece was kind of, it had 3 stories, and it was documenting my transition. So I've always talked about polyamory or consensual non-monogamy as being a placeholder as I sort of push back against compulsory monogamy and state-sanctioned marriage. But I know that's only a resting place, because that is in and of itself also a form of settler sexuality. It's not ultimately critical and decolonizing in the way that I think we want to go. But it does get us a little bit towards thinking about that. But what I did in those stories was I talked about, I'm getting to a point now of thinking in terms of life partners that are beyond the category of romantic. And so again, I know I could articulate with queer theory on this too, although I'm gonna stay away from that for a second. But I've been thinking a lot about, realizing that my polyamory includes platonic life partners, and I have more of those. Like, I actually had to scale back on romantic partners kind of to 1, not only because of COVID, but also I refuse to call myself monogamous, because what I have done in that scaling back is I had to think about who was in my bubble, and I was only willing to have 1 of my romantic partners in my bubble. The others, like, I didn't have space because I have life partners that are my friends that are family to me. And I have 3 people like that. They are family. They're in my bubble. And so I realized they really are like life partners, but they're like friends, you would call them in English, right? But I don't think about them like that. And I wrote in this story about, well, I could adopt them like as siblings, which I could do in my culture. I could have a sibling adoption ceremony, but that's not really how it plays out. They're not like siblings. They're more like part-time life partners. And we spend a lot of time together. We'll go stay in each other's houses for weeks or months at a time when we travel. And so I've really been thinking about that, right? Like, who are my life partners and who do I have responsibility to? And that means I have to cut back on those other partnerships. And then that was reminding me of how settler culture tells us that we're supposed to find the one, and they're a romantic the one, and sex has to go with that one. And then what happens? You end up neglecting, you kind of hone in on this nuclear family that's couple centered. And when the couple dissolves, the family's broken. this term family, broken family is just horrendous. It's her, you know, and so I'm trying to talk in this story and in some of this new work about the fact that we can dissolve the couple and we can still think about ways to retain the family. And I'm using all of this language that that my ancestors wouldn't have needed to use, because they didn't necessarily have the reproductive couple at the center of the family. The pre-productive couple was part of a family, but the family didn't hinge on them. And so that kind of imposition makes our families much less stable. You know, so ultimately, really what we can say is settlers have terrible family values, because they're setting up families that are less stable, that are less sustainable. And so anyway, I know I'm kind of going off all over the place, but that's kind of the stuff I'm working towards, and thinking, like, moving through polyamory to get to something more decolonized. So
yeah, and that's kind of like, that's really useful in terms of teaching in a Department of Family Relations, even though but I do teach in family theory. So these things are helpful. And I would say that, you know, the way in which we're trying to teach about family and family relations is cracking open and moving in different ways. Like we're asking questions about, you know, what is the family? So I come along with my plants or whatever and teach about that. But, you know, there are other entry points and ways in which we can untangle that. And I do see that. I mean, I don't come from the family relations field, but I have to teach in it now. And so I've had a chance to, you know, to sort of start to try to think through some of these things. And I think it's cool how we can use like what you're talking about here. And also I see it happening, you know, in some of the other ways we're trying to do, you know, theoretical work around it. So, but the decolonizing part is another thing. Like you say, I think thinking more about what that means is good, because, and I will say, you know, like, this is great because I'm trying to think about Indigenous family theory or decolonizing family theory. And so, you know, what does that look like? Who, you know, and I'd be glad to hear, like, is there people who are writing about that in particular, right? Some of the things we're kind of like grappling with here. And maybe that's where you're going with this too, right? Like decolonizing family theory. That's my selfish thing, because I'm trying to figure out.
No, I think it's applicable. I don't use the term family as much as I use the term like relatives, right? But yeah, okay. You know, obviously we're all just throwing these partially good words out there.
Yeah, or relations or relationality, you know, all my relations, all that kind of, thing.
And I'm comfortable with sitting at the table with people who use different words, and we're still trying to have a mutually intelligible conversation, but using, because we're coming out of different genealogies, right, in different communities. So, yeah.
I think what's increasingly interesting as you're going through all of this is, and Kim, you've alluded to it a few times with TP Confessions, but all of you are actually not just pushing the boundaries of intellectual space, you're pushing the boundaries of the built environment of the university. And so, you know, I'm very familiar with Kim Anderson's Crocom's cabin that she's building as part of her CRC. Kim Tallbear is doing the TP Confessions, and Trisha is just on her way to putting together an application to build an environment that supports her physical fitness interests as research, but also how to bring ceremony into those spaces. The idea of strength being integral to the kinds of ways that people should start seeing themselves to reclaim that space of strength. So I thought maybe everybody could talk a little bit about why changing the built environment of university is so important to the kind of intellectual space you want to push the boundaries on. I can pick on one of you.
I feel like I've talked a lot, so I was going to wait for somebody else.
Tricia, do you want to?
Sure, yeah, I can jump in. I think we need to create these spaces in order to dig deeper into our intellectual theorizing, coupled with this embodiment practice. And we just can't get that in the Western colonial academic institution that we are also working within. And so, you know, thinking about reconciliation, and how many universities are really trying to foster better relations with their Indigenous faculty, staff, and students. And what does that mean in terms of creating uniquely Indigenous spaces on campus? And I think that's where we have a lot of opportunity to start carving out these spaces that are based in Indigenous intellectual ways of being. And for myself, I'm working with a team at the part of the University of Ottawa. We're going to be building what we've for now called Intellectual and Land-Based Research Lab. And so this is going to be a place where we can have all of the things that we're talking about here today in terms of creating relations, having really deep intellectual conversations with folks, but also having that connection on the land, being close to the water. And what might this mean to really create a space for an Indigenous research methodologies on campus, apart from the office spaces or apart from the Western spaces that we also have access to. What would it mean to create a uniquely indigenized space for that, and where we could foster language learning, where we could foster land-based learning, where we could foster ceremony, and both ceremony personally, but also with groups together. That's something that I'm really interested in. And so I think this is the responsibility a lot of universities are trying to take up in ways where we can create these spaces on campus.
So that's right on, because that's what I'm doing too, right? Which I think is good. I mean, one of the things that happens, of course, in academia is you're supposed to be the only one or the first one to do this and all this. And when we wrote our grant, so it's me, Brittany Luby, the Anishinaabe historian, and Sherry Longboat, who's a Haudenosaunee scholar in planning. And when we wrote it, I said, we want to build a Granny's Lodge in our university arboretum. But I said, and you're supposed to write, nobody in Canada has done this. I said, I hope everybody does it. Because I think everybody could, or whatever, people do whatever. But if we are all doing the same thing, then that seems cool, because it seems like something that needs to be done. So that's awesome to hear about that. And, let me know if you want to see the application we did for the CFI. But in short, that's what we're doing too. I think back to, I had a student that I was out, so we have a beautiful arboretum at the University of Guelph. And I had a student out in the bush one day, and the student says to me, "This is the first time I felt safe on campus, 2 years into their degree," or whatever it was. And I thought, wow, we know that, right? The campus space doesn't necessarily feel safe for a whole bunch of reasons. You don't feel like you belong, you feel alienated, whatever. And so that was part of what we were thinking about, building our granny's home inside the arboretum, so that you have, unlike if you're in the middle of campus, you have access, it's a fluid space between land and the lab space. Ours is a research lab too. So, we're doing that in terms of a permanent space, as permanent research lab space to work on relationality. And then all those other things that come along with it, right? Ceremony and gardens and so on. But, we've done also, how do we take up how to temporarily occupy spaces. So me and Brittany Luby again, and Leanne Letty, who's another Anishinaabe historian, we've done performance art. So Leanne and I dressed up in jail outfits, and we sat on the Sir John A. Macdonald statue at Laurier. And then we were invited to do this thing for a Canada 150 event. So we got together all the women at the 3 local universities, and we all dressed up as our grannies, as if we were going to a ball at Confederation, and we occupied the lunch, and then we did this whole panel and everything. So we found ways of doing performance art as temporary ways of offering space, or as of taking up space in resistance, but also, we did a performance for the river. So also trying to use performance art as creating relationality. And then we did another artivist project where Brittany had an idea. She wanted to raise awareness about missing and murdered women. So she's like, let's get all these people on campus, and we'll make a human medicine wheel on the football field. And then we'll go up and we'll take, aerial photographs, and we'll do this thing. And so we actually did it, which was this educational thing. But what was most interesting to me was people commenting afterwards about how much they appreciated us kind of occupying and shifting a very masculinist kind of collegiate space where people, like a football game, you think about homecoming and all this stuff that goes on, right? And how many of us don't feel we feel in some ways threatened or alienated by some of those masculinist college kind of spaces. And so can we shift those spaces in some way? And we did it with ceremony, like we had, we're out there on the turf grass with the elder going around with the smudge and doing our thing. So I think there are like permanent ways, there's like temporary ways, there's all sorts of like little spaces that you can start to set up so that people have these places of reprieve, so that they don't feel like the first time they ever felt safe on campus was when they, they're out in the little woods with their auntie/professor, right? So I think that that's an Indigenous feminist practice too for me, because it came out of the university hiring a cluster of Indigenous faculty. A number of us are women. We just, like, I didn't know Brittany before, right? We just end up like, we're both hired into this university at the same time, and then they're like, hey, you get together and you get a few Indigenous women together and we start organizing all this stuff, right? Because of course there's stuff to resist, there's artwork to do, there's this, there's that. So yeah, I think that, to me, again, that goes back to my thinking about how women can develop kinship and organizing. Like you get them together, and next thing you know, they're doing things that shift in maybe small ways, but in some way shift the campus and the campus space, right? I don't know if we're decolonizing, but we're doing a little bit of something. So I'm glad to hear you're going to do it something at Ottawa.
I always go back to that whenever I use the word decolonize. And there might be other sources too that people want to foreground, but I go back to, what Tuck and Yang said about it's the restitution or repatriation of Indigenous land and life.
Yeah.
And life is, so what materially, or ultimately materially are we attempting to restore, right? And so in working, I go between the sciences and this kinds of more creative project that is TP Confessions and the sexualities work that we do. And in the sciences, it's about, you can turn back the DNA and the biological samples. Indigenous communities can have control and authority over their data. They can be building their own labs, right? Their own scientific workforce. To me, all of that is the restitution of both resources and life. Instead of us allowing our DNA, our biologicals, to be appropriated by people building institutions that are really for the settler state, building their economies, their wealth, their institutions, training their graduate students, we can retain that and think about building our own worlds around that if we want to do that. But also in relation to the creative stuff, you were making me think, both of you, there's this theater downtown, like downtown Edmonton's kind of a ghost town right now, like more than usual. It's not usually. Anyway, there's this big theater called the Paramount, which has just been empty for a couple of years. And I have this fantasy about buying the Paramount. And because we're always looking for appropriate theaters around Edmonton for our confession show, and it's really hard to find the right space, the right size. We need something that's in the middle. We're not small enough and we're not big enough for most of the theaters here. And, that has the right tech support and that doesn't have columns in front of the stage, that will let us have food or that will let us do everything we want to do. And I thought, God, wouldn't it be great to buy that theater? And then we could actually fit the whole Faculty of Native Studies in there, because I cannot stand this old brick building we have on campus. It's like historical, but it's haunted. So we don't like to work in there late at night because there's spirits slamming doors and stuff, because it was a hospital during the Spanish flu epidemic. Also, it's just really square and horrible. Like it really dampens your creative vibe, Anyway, so I'm thinking, can I write a CFI and buy the Paramount? I don't know. And then thinking maybe I should get together with some, Native playwrights and actors and theater people here, right? Maybe we need like a theater cooperative or something. Now somebody's going to take that idea, which is great. I had give me a piece of it. But anyway, that would be really, I've been thinking a lot about how the physical space of the institution is really limiting our creativity and limiting our ability to network and work collaboratively, because it's set up with these small individual offices and typical classrooms. And this is not the way that we're beginning to work in a lot of our creative work in the Faculty of Native Studies. So anyway, you're both inspiring me.
I think what's really cool is that there is this element of creativity. I know that, Most people think academics are really sort of boring, nerdish, and we are all those things. But there's also a lot of creativity. Kim and I have been in performances together, weirdly enough, right? And so you just, you roll with the punches, and you sing, dance, play the piano, whatever it is somebody makes you do. And I think allowing for those spaces of creativity allows people to open up and to start thinking differently as well, that they don't have to think in these really sort of controlled environments. So it's 8:05, and we have a number of questions. So Victoria has been reading the questions, and she's going to ask them for you guys.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say Mcguire for sharing all of your perspectives. I think it's really important for the younger and upcoming generations of Eco-Wug that are doing work similar to that, in our undergrads or masters or whatever, to hear all of you say those things. I just wanted to put a quick plug in that relates to this panel, that we're doing a book club, highlighting Indigenous feminisms, and right now we're trying to utilize Ian Simpson's Quay's theory, or Quay's resurgence theory, to kind of converse what you were all talking about, and how Quay is everything. Woman, an Indigenous woman is everything. But yeah, I just wanted to say it's truly inspiring work. I know we've been chatting the entire time, just being like mind blown, where it's so important for us to hear you share your truth. So we kind of made a list of some of the questions that were coming up. So the first one is, how can we work towards changing Indigenous studies programs in First Nations high schools, colleges, and universities to incorporate Indigenous women's issues, sexuality, family life, traditional governance, etc. So I would love to put that on the table for you to answer. And I'm not afraid to put on you either, like Brenda was saying. I'm just kidding.
Okay, sorry. I was just going to say, as I started out by saying, there's lots of literature out there. There's lots of people doing stuff. So, I mean, that's kind of a simple answer, like an easy answer is, get a hold of some of these bibliography. Just start putting that literature there on your courses, and have the students work through it, the material, or other things like, looking at performance, whatever it is. Integrating Indigenous scholarship, Indigenous art, performance, and all that kind of thing. If this is about women, into the course material. That's my easy answer. Now I can rest while the others say something more clever.
I think this is a really great question, and I'm going to continue to think about it, because my role within the Faculty of Education is I get to teach teacher candidates about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit perspectives, and how to weave in Indigenous perspectives in all of their teachables once they're future teachers. And so I take that responsibility on because I have a young son, and I want him to see himself represented, and as he grows and as he attends elementary, secondary schools. And so I want the teacher candidates to become comfortable with integrating Indigenous perspectives. But what I have yet to do is to think about how the process of Indigenous feminism can also impact teacher candidates' learning about Indigenous ways of being and thinking in the classroom. So that's some work that I'm going to continue to think about, but I think it'd be an interesting complement to some of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit perspectives courses across the country that are foundational to teachers candidates now, due to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And then, to think about an Indigenous feminist lens within doing that, some of that work, that would be, something I'm really curious about too.
I think it's kind of chicken and egg, right? Like, you need Indigenous feminists around to do that work, but you need to make sure that they get hired. And I've been in situations where women are running everything, including, even though we have a male dean, he doesn't really run everything. So, and and there's a lot of encouragement of women's strength and authority within our faculty. So but yeah, I can't, I guess well, I can imagine. I've been in other Native studies programs at different levels where it was much more male dominated and straight male dominated. And it was definitely harder to maneuver with the feminism. I don't know. I don't know how you solve that. I left those places actually, which is not an answer, Maybe somebody has more insight into that.
Maybe Brenda too, if you wanted to try to kind of answer that.
Well, I think it's hard, and I think it's hard because our communities have also accepted all of these ideas about patriarchy and heteronormativity. And so we have to do a lot of unpacking in our own communities and amongst ourselves before we start building that in. But working around more women, and the reality is undergraduate and graduate populations are largely female in Indigenous studies. And so they will change the face of the discipline simply because they're the ones who are coming out with PhDs and are the ones that will be hired in this next generation. The explosion in the numbers of women working, even if they're not in Native studies departments, but in universities, is remarkable from the late 80s to now. Winona Wheeler was the only person in Native studies when I was an undergraduate. So I think those huge changes will come. So it's not a great answer, Anita, but right now it's what we're working with. And I think you just stick things in the crack, right? You start talking about a small thing and somebody will eventually see that it takes them someplace else.
Yeah, thank you all for that. I think it's really helpful as someone who, is experiencing post-secondary education right now as well. The next question I wanted to kind of bring up intersects with another question another attendee came up with. So it was, what are your thoughts on the intersections of Indigenous feminisms and eco-feminisms? But I find it really relates to what someone else wrote about nurturing good relations with waterways, plants, and animals in our lives, and how to shift theory into practice. So if maybe someone wanted to talk about that relationship between Indigenous feminisms and eco-feminisms.
Yeah, I have to say, I should know the ecofeminism literature better than I do because I used to work with Carolyn Merchant at University of California, Berkeley. She hired me. And I remember reading and teaching her stuff. I feel like we're naturally already doing ecofeminism, but I would need to see, remember what the definition of that is. I mean, I remember the critiques of nature and the alignment of women with nature historically by scientists and the development of the scientific method, all of that. Also the alignment of Indigenous people with nature, right? We were part of nature. So in the same way that women were considered part of nature. And so these are the reasons that you have, eco-feminists doing the kinds of critiques they were doing. And so I feel like we're kind of already there, but I don't know that we necessarily don't use that label.
I certainly found it useful when I was trying to write my, stuff around why we need to read feminist literature. Because I was like, look over here, people are doing this stuff. It's important for us to think about that. Look over here. But I'm a little rusty on it at this point because, and when I was doing that, it was like Carolyn Merchant. And now who knows what's going on out there. I haven't read it, right? So it's kind of hard to answer that question. But there certainly are, things that align, right? Which is why and it was helpful in being able to say to people, feminism isn't just like this thing that all this negative discourse has turned it into, like man haters and this and that. There's all sorts of things. There's like ecofeminism, for example, that's really useful and that aligns with some of the things that we're talking about. But sorry, I don't have a very up-to-date good answer on that one either.
Sorry, I'm not at all familiar with ecofeminism either, but it sounds interesting. I'll have to look into it.
There's some great new writing, relatively new, and I should have the book in front of me. Melissa Nelson, who I think just moved from San Francisco State to ASU, Turtle Mountain, Chippewa. She has an article in Joanne Barker's book, what is it called? Critically Sovereign, I think. The last chapter of that book is by Melissa, and it's on Indigenous eco-erotics, and she's telling stories, like traditional stories, like when a woman marries the stick. Anyway, it's kind of, Melissa and I were in conversation with these white feminist ecosexuals, and we were talking about what makes Indigenous eco-erotics different, right? And it is this sort of not centering sex, but centering relationality that can include sex. That's some of the really interesting stuff that's happening right now. So I would encourage people to read that chapter by Melissa. Plus, it's really funny too, like when she's talking about the stick marriage, the woman married to the stick. And we have a lot of these stories, right, of humans and non-humans getting married in these traditional stories.
Maybe we'll be able to put a link up to the book because I'm kind of curious now. Yeah, I don't know, Brenda, if you wanted to say anything or not. No, okay. But speaking of relationality, it's kind of a good segue to the next question about how do you discern between relationship and relationality? Can you recommend any writers / thinkers on relationality? I would say all of you, but yeah, definitely opening it up.
I'm just thinking about who I'm citing these days, so I need a minute.
Yeah, I'm trying to think, was there somebody who I can turn to who like defined relationality? And, I think it's just become such a common vernacular within Indigenous feminism, but also within land-based thinking and learning. It's just become, from my understanding, just like a really common concept to think about our ongoing relationships to our people, our community, our lands, our waters, our animal relations. Maybe it's Sean Wilson, 2008. He talks about relational accountability and research. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure who coined it, but it sort of makes it more of a verb, more of an action that you're actually actively going out and seeking. And where I started learning about relationships was actually from Ella Cara Deloria's work in Speaking of Indians from the 1940s, where she talked about the Teoshpe. And Teoshpe inspired me to find out what the word would be in Cree, which is Wakotwin. So I think but what she spoke about was the act of making relatives. It wasn't something that passively happened to you. It was something that you had to actively seek out and to create, because it defined your humanity. It defined your center of community.
Yeah, I cite a lot of people who don't use that word, but who are doing that work. And also my formative theorists are often not I have ancestors that were my formative theorists, and they were not academics, of course. But then even today, of course, I'll read inside the academic literature. There's so much that's interesting happening, including mostly in Indigenous studies for me, and in some of the queer theory literature, especially. But also, I still cite people in community. And I was thinking a lot about when I was watching what was happening at Standing Rock and paying really close attention, particularly to some of the women and Two-Spirit people that were there, and the way they were talking about, I don't remember where I read this or saw this, and I was on a lot of Facebook groups of people that were there and sending money to people. But I remember at one point there was a conversation going on where people were talking about Miniwachoni, and we're talking about digging into the language and talking about actually what that meant. And this is another instance in which the way they were talking about water and the way that water is life, but water carries life. Water constitutes life. To say water is life is a real watering down of what that really means. it's so much deeper and more complex than that. And they were attempting to talk about that. That was a theoretical framework for me, the idea of Mcguire, right? And so it was an analysis of relationality. Now, those women at Standing Rock would never say, we're doing an analysis of relationality, right? But they would be some of the best theorists I would cite on this kind of stuff. So again, looking at the way that people are trying to use the language, in most of us are learning. Most of us aren't very good at it yet. But the way we're thinking through the language to talk about these relationships, and activists, I think, are some of the best theorists out there.
Great answer. There's so many other questions that a lot of our attendees had, but just a part of our conversation piece, I'll finish with this one for our panelists. So how do Indigenous conceptions of gender compare to settler conceptions of gender? Who was woman, man, or someone else?
Sorry, what was the last part of that question, Victoria? I didn't catch the very last part.
Basically, the comparison of our understandings of gender between Indigenous communities and settler communities. So our understandings, like, I don't know, for me, it brings up gender inclusivity and two-spiritedness and how even that is interpreted differently between our communities. So yeah, I'll just read it one more time. So how do Indigenous conceptions of gender compare to settler conceptions of gender? Who was woman, who was man, and who was someone else?
It's kind of a big one, and it has to do with, you know, like, you can't totally go pan-Indigenous on this because it does have to do with language. It has to do with the lands you're in, the cultures that come out of those places and spaces, the relationships. So it's hard to, even though I've done this in my own work, try to, you know, make these broad categorizations. But the reason why I hesitate is because I do feel like this needs to go back into particular languages and cultures to be able to respond, you know, and maybe that's the response, is like, that's the kind of work that needs to be done, or the work that some of us are, you know, doing or trying, or, you know, aspiring to, or whatever. So I don't know. I mean, maybe that's like my 8:30 at night cop-out answer, because I don't feel like coming up with something like really tight for that. Because I could, based on stuff that I've done and written, but I'm more reluctant to do that now. Because I feel like I need to, I feel like, you know, you can say like, well, you know, there's the gendered pronouns don't exist in certain languages and all that kind of stuff. But I think you need to be more particular and knowledgeable to be able to speak about that than I am at this point, anyways. This point in the day too. I don't know. I don't know what others think.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think you have to go to the languages, and I'm really interested in language groups that are attempting to work these things out, because I think, as Brenda was saying earlier, of course, many of our elders who are the ones who speak the languages best have been thoroughly indoctrinated into heteronormativity, into gender binarism, and also had those things shame, you know. It's not that they may not have grown up around people who had knowledges about, you know, what we would today call Indigenous sexualities, but that stuff would have been severely sanctioned and shamed, right, to talk about those things. And so I remember Tricia Bear telling me that she's part of a group, I can't remember the name of it, but they're talking about sexy things in Cree. And I remember talking to some young Dakota people, again, on Facebook around Standing Rock, and they were saying that they were trying to have a language group too, where they were talking about, you know, sex and marriage and relationships. And it's a great way to learn language, because the more scandalous and intriguing you can get, the more people pay attention, right? And learn the language. But also there's a sense of, you know, we may have to dig deep into the fundamental frameworks and value systems and reconstitute reconstitute or re-articulate some of these ways of thinking about how we relate to one another now. So it's not only a reclamation or revitalization project, and I'm not sure what but it's a kind of a new articulation of some of these ideas, but again, based in the worldview that inheres in the language that we have. So I'm looking forward to the future, to people doing this work and to answering this question.
Yeah, it seems to me that part of the conversation tonight has unveiled a number of things that we're all interested in knowing about. And so we're hopeful that somebody coming up is going to take on that work and fill those spaces, because that's what happens. I love the way Kim has been referring to genealogies of knowledge. And so we need people to come after us and to fill out that genealogical space for the next generation and the generations that come. So I really want to thank all of you for coming tonight. I want to thank our participants for giving up this time, an hour and a half in an evening. And of course, Kim Tallbear is actually in Alberta right now. So she's in the past still, going to catch up to us. And for all of the participants that came tonight, I really appreciate your commitment to coming and your enthusiasm and the questions. And in particular, I want to thank Tag and Victoria for all of the work that they did in setting everything up in such a short period of time. They're very great. I'm very lucky to work with them. So thank you so much. Hope to see you again. And hi, all my relations.
Miigwetch, thank you so much.
Justin.
Young Moms in.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Have a
Happy
good
International Women's Day.
night. Now you can rest.
Now we can go and eat.
That's right.
Yeah.
See ya.
Bye-bye. Have a good night.
Great job, team.